The book is about my discovery of what the Federal Reserve System really is. And my curiosity was aroused by this in the beginning because I was a struggling filmmaker with a rattling crusader gene. I had decided at an early age, right after I got married, I had myself a beautiful wife and a couple of little kids that I loved dearly, got to thinking about issues outside of my own skin, began to realize that things were not going well out there if you are willing to look a little bit beneath the surface at least. And I felt a burning sensation, kind of a startling thing for me because up until that time, I was pretty much like most young people. I was all about me, me, me. How am I looking? How am I doing? Am I making enough money? What am I going to do on my next vacation? What's my next hobby going to be? Who's going to win the baseball game? Things like that. It was all materialistic, non uh, subsequently important information. But all of a sudden, my life turned, and I decided that I had to do something to save the bloody planet. As stupid as that may sound, that's still my motive. That's still my mission. So anyway, I quit my corporate job. I was doing pretty well in the corporate world. And I decided I was going to go off as a crusader rabbit. And so I quit my job. And the only thing I knew how to do from my prior experience, from what I'd studied in school, was communications. And I'd worked in television and radio quite a bit as a young guy. So I thought, well, I will see if I can produce some very low budget films, documentary films, we call them. In those days, they were more like little series of still pictures that you flash on the screen with a recorded soundtrack uh, moaning over the loudspeaker system. And very low budget stuff. You could do it yourself practically for pennies. And so I was producing those to try and put groceries on the table. And I decided that I wanted to come up with a documentary on inflation. I didn't really understand inflation, but I thought that that's a good topic. Everybody is worried about inflation, even in the day when we didn't have very much of it. If we could have seen the kind of inflation that we have today, if we could have seen it back then, we would have probably been howling like cats with their tail in a rat trap or something. Anyway, I started to find out what the cause of inflation was. And that led me, of course, eventually to this thing called the Federal Reserve System. And that's what I learned then. Let's get to the chase. What is the book about? The book is about what I learned. And I got the curiosity going when I learned, first of all, that the Federal Reserve System was created under conditions of great secrecy. It was created under such tight conditions of confidentiality and security that I don't think many wars of history were ever conceived, surprise attacks or anything like that, were ever conceived under conditions of greater secrecy. I mean, it was all done by a meeting made up of seven of the most powerful bankers representing the big banking interests in the United States. This is back in 1910. This all happened. The representatives of the largest financial institutions in America came together and decided to have a secret meeting off away from New York, where all the banking centers were. And they went to Jekyll Island in Georgia, which was a privately owned island in those days, owned by the most powerful people in the United States, the great financiers, the industrialists, some of the politicians, and so forth. The ones with the most money were, huddled in New York, and they decided to get away from New York, and they certainly did not want to go to Washington D.C. They wanted to be in secret, so they went to this private island called Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. And it was owned by these wealthy families and dynasties. And they had a clubhouse. It's still there, by the way, been beautifully restored, called the Jekyll Island Clubhouse. And that's where they went. And they spent about 10 days there. This was in November of 1910. And they hammered together all the nuts and bolts and the schedules. And what I discovered is I figured that when people do something in secret, it's because they have something to hide. So that aroused my curiosity. And I said, well, what is it that they're trying to hide? Well, it didn't take long to figure it out. When you start reading the documents and the books and the reports referenced by these people or written by these people themselves, that where they're speaking very openly but privately about what they're doing, it didn't take very long to figure it out. So let's cut to the chase. What did they do? They created a banking cartel. It's no different than a banana cartel or an oil cartel or even a drug cartel for that matter. It just happens to be a banking cartel. And a cartel, in case that word is a little bit strange to some of your folks out there, as it was to me at first, I always thought the cartel, well, that was the Mexican cartel, right? Well, yes, but it's more than that. I discovered that it was at the turn of the century, precisely at this time, that the world, especially in America and the more advanced countries, Western Europe, the world was swinging away from private ownership, or not private ownership, but from private operations, separate competitive enterprises competing against each other and joining together, not all in one corporation, but coming together as competitors and agreeing not to compete with each other. So they acted as essentially one industry or one enterprise in the fact that they all agreed to the prices and all they divided up the products among them. And they decided that as long as they didn't have to compete, they could always make more profits and be less creative in the products they offer because they controlled both the supply and the demand. And that was a shocker to me. I realized that not only was this the trend at that time in history, the conversion of independent, completely independent corporations or private family institutions competing with each other, almost the world was just rushing headlong and everywhere you looked, joining together to get rid of competition. And it was John D. Rockefeller the first who said, is quoted by several of his biographers, he said, quote, competition is a sin. Well, that was the kind of the motto of creating these cartels. So I discovered that the Federal Reserve System was not a government agency. In fact, had very little to do with the government, except that the government took their secret document that they drafted on Jekyll Island, then they took it back to Washington, D.C., and they redecorated it. They took an eraser. This is imaginary now, but imagine taking the eraser and erasing from the top of the page where it said cartel agreement, which it didn't, of course, but that's what it was. Imagine erasing that and then writing on top of it the Federal Reserve Act. Basically, what they did was that they took a cartel agreement, they took it to Washington, D.C., and they sponsored it through a couple of their political influencers, and they made it into law. So now a private cartel agreement had the force and effect of law. And so you and I today are obliged to obey a private cartel agreement because the law requires us to do that. And we think that, well, if we don't do this, we go to prison, right? Well, only government can put you in prison. So therefore, this law is a government law, when in fact it is not. It is a private law that was publicized and made official government policy by passing it into law. Now, once you understand the basic root of this whole thing, now you can begin to understand why the Federal Reserve System never has met its proclaimed goals. Now, its proclaimed goals from the beginning, even to today, is how to stabilize the economy, how to make it best for the working man, for the average citizen, to protect his savings from being destroyed in the long term through inflation, for example. It's all about how they are going to protect us. That's what they say. But then you realize, well, wait a minute, they're a cartel. What does the cartel do? All cartels, without exception, have one purpose and only one purpose, and that is to advance the interests of the members of the cartel. Now, what they say could be something entirely different, but what they do is always that. Otherwise, they have no justification for even existing. That is what I discovered, and that is what I wrote about in my book, is what happens when you allow a private cartel to parade as a government agency, to dictate all policies regarding money and interest. All economic issues are dictated by this hidden hand that's pretending to be your government, and it's not. In fact, the Congress and the president, nobody can do anything at all about it according to the original act. They have no say so. They can bring them up and ask questions and scold them and also, but they have no political power to do anything to affect the policies of the Federal Reserve System. Their only power is to abolish it. If they don't like it, they can abolish it. That's the only power they have. They know that the banking fraternity, let's call it, the business of international banking, it's really international, has so much power over the press, over the media, that they can make you or me look like an angel or a villain overnight just by the way they twist the news. They know that it's very difficult, if not impossible, to win an election if the media is against you. And if you go against the Federal Reserve System, you will have the media against you. This is part of the hidden control mechanism. So they may not like the Federal Reserve. They may, like some of our more recent political figures, talked it down. Oh, we got to do something about the Federal. That's terrible. And they talk, but they don't do because they're afraid of this power that really controls them. To put the final cap on the answer to your question, what I wrote about, what the book is all about, is that I discovered the most shocking thing I never dreamed as a young man could possibly be true. And that is, instead of the federal government controlling the Federal Reserve System, it means the banks, control the government. And this is the core of most of our problems today.
Yeah, thank you so much. Amazing to hear it coming from yourself and laying out your findings and your discovery process. So is the whole goal of the Federal Reserve control